UK House of Commons passed a motion in early May to declare climate change an emergency, and it was spurred by Extinction Rebellion, the activist group, but also by the Swedish teenager Greta Thunberg, who really instigated the strike on Friday for school children. So they were striking in Sweden on a Friday to try and get more attention to climate change, but that her campaign has now spread to other countries. So when she was in the UK, she met Michael Gove and Jeremy Corbyn, and then the motion has been passed. Recognition to the emergency of climate change has also been brought to our attention by Sir David Attenborough. As you may have seen some of his television documentaries, the one on the 18th of April this year was entitled Climate Change, The Facts, which was shown on BBC One. And it drew attention really to the manifestations of climate change today, the greater floods, the greater storms, and the extinction of certain species, about which he is very worried, because he said, you know, some of the species cannot support the heat waves that are now in existence. The extinction of species was also confirmed by a UN report called the Global Assessment Report on Biodiversity, which came out in early May, and that drew the world's attention and put them on notice that there will be 1 million loss of species if we carry on the way we are. So there is a lot of evidence about the emergency of climate change, but there have also been controversial elements. There's been business companies who, fearing perhaps that their profits may be affected, particularly those in the oil and gas industries, have played down the effects of climate change. And as you will know, some politicians, notably President Trump, has said that there's an exaggeration about climate change, and he has withdrawn his country, the United States, from the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement was instigated by the United Nations framework on climate change as a means of drawing attention and getting agreement of countries to reducing climate change problems, but also in reducing greenhouse gases. So with this somewhat controversial elements, on the one hand the emergency, and on the other Trump and others playing down climate change, I'm going to use the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, particularly Goal 13 on climate change, to chart a way through. So the climate change, the Sustainable Development Goals were brought to our attention by the United Nations in 2016. There's 17 goals, of which climate change is one, and it was recognised by the UN that it was necessary to have international cooperation to deal with climate change because it passes national boundaries, and also for the developed world to help developing countries. And so the goals, the 69 targets within the 17 goals, were to help the planet in the next few years until 2030 to deal with some of the issues. And the Paris Agreement runs alongside that. So, to take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts, one of the UN conventional, the Climate Change Convention, has set financial targets for companies and for businesses joining together, well, companies and governments joining together to reach by year 2020, which is not very long ahead now, a total of 100 billion US dollars annually. Now that's a lot of money, so this UN Green Climate Fund is seeking to raise that amount of money, which will go to a long extent to help developing countries to reach low carbon emissions. So this financial implication for companies in particular is one of the ethical aspects really that companies need to address. So moving now to what are the ethical implications for global business companies. There are, first of all, some problems about identifying ethics in this context. The UN has said that most of the discussions, I think you'll probably agree with this, have been on the scientific side and the technical side. There's been very little discourse about some of the ethical implications for businesses or indeed governments in this field. So the UNESCO body, the United Nations Scientific, Education and Cultural Organisation, decided it wanted to fill the gap and try and find what are the ethical aspects of climate change. And to do that, they asked a body called COMEST, which is the Committee on Ethics for Science and Technology, to identify the ethical issues in climate change. And they started, COMEST, by saying, well, there's two problems really because of the uncertainty surrounding climate change and also vulnerability for some territories. Regarding uncertainty, they said there's two types of uncertainty: the uncertainty of some of the scientific findings and then the uncertainty of actually what the ethical issues are. And then another aspect they drew out, COMEST, was vulnerability. They said the vulnerability lies for certain territories, small low-lying islands, large river deltas, and the persons who are residing in the Arctic, where there's been the loss of the summer Arctic ice. So they're given those constraints, if you like, of vulnerability and uncertainty. We have seen the uncertainty in recent years. For example, in the United States in 2017, we had a range of hurricanes, and it was uncertain where Hurricane Irma was going to go, and it wasn't clear where it was going to end up. And we have also seen a powerful cyclone in India this May. So certainly vulnerability and uncertainty is present. Nevertheless, COMEST did identify ethical issues facing climate change, and those are very pertinent really to read, and Robin has a full paper of mine that he can make available electronically to anybody who wants it, that does give the details about that report. Nevertheless, I decided that I wouldn't use their recommendations or their ethical issues per se, and I'm drawing more attention to some of the financial aspects of ethical responsibilities for companies. But I will identify the three ethical principles that I want to put forward. And one is the ethical principle of financial sacrifice for the common good. The second is the ethical principle of solidarity, and the third is the ethical principle of the rights of and concerns for future generations. And I'll just run through those. So the first one, the ethical principle of financial sacrifice for the common good. It's necessary first to say what is the common good. It's a notion that originated over 2,000 years ago in the writings of Plato, Aristotle and Cicero, and more recently by the contemporary ethicist John Rawls, who defined the common good as certain general conditions that are equally to everyone's advantage. So examples of common goods or parts of common goods are clean air and an unpolluted environment. But the common good does not just happen. It needs to be maintained, it needs to be established and maintained, and requires cooperative efforts, and business companies are among those organisations needed to make sacrifices for the common good. The sort of sacrifices that business companies are needed to make are to reduce their carbon footprint, to invest in low carbon technology, to watch the climate change scientific findings and perhaps to invest there as well. But in addition, this green fund, the UN Green Climate Fund that I mentioned earlier, which seeks to raise by 2020 this $100 billion US, that is for governments and businesses to invest in. So certainly from the business side, they are being expected to pay monies into that fund, although when President Trump withdrew the US from the Paris Agreement, he immediately stopped the US contributions to this UN Green Climate Fund. And there are other financial recommendations too by the World Bank and also nationally. The UK had a UN fund for climate change, which was a national one, but it has privatised it since to Macquarie, the Australian bank, so it's a little uncertain as to perhaps what use will be made of that in the private context. So the second ethical principle of solidarity, again, a definition of solidarity is the unity of a group or class which produces or is based on unities of objectives, interests and sympathies. So solidarity refers to the ties in a society that bind people together as one. And the term has been used in sociology, in religion and philosophy. And Emile Durkheim, the sociologist, wrote about solidarity in his book, The Division of Labour in Society, 1893. And it's also a concept in Catholic social teaching, which some of you may be aware of, and is deemed a characteristic of society where each person is connected and dependent on all humanity, collectively and individually. So in the case of business companies, how have they shown solidarity? Some of them have followed the United Nations Caring for Climate initiative, which is intended as a leadership initiative for companies to join who are willing to go ahead and promote their activities and in general to try and get other companies to care for the climate, to take this leadership role, to help prevent climate change crises by implementing practical solutions and policies and sharing experiences. Signatories to Caring for Climate are from companies in the UK, Denmark, Germany, Portugal, Spain, the US, China, Pakistan and Sri Lanka, to name a few, and they are united in the belief that climate change risks are everybody's concern and everybody's business. But in the US, where President Trump has come out or brought his country out of the Paris Agreement, that doesn't mean that all US companies agree with that. And a group of leading American companies put full-page advertisements in their national newspapers, the New York Times, Washington Post, addressed to President Trump saying, you know, it really is a good idea if we are in the Paris Agreement because we can take this leadership role on behalf of the US. These large corporations signing off these advertisements included Apple, Facebook, Google, Hewlett-Packard, Microsoft and Morgan Stanley, so there were quite a range of different types of companies. Another expression in the US for the Paris Agreement has flourished at state and city levels, where city mayors and state governors have joined the "We Are Still In" campaign, which business companies in America have also joined. So, we've got these two dimensions now of the US coming out of the Paris Agreement, but a number of companies still working towards those ends. So the third ethical principle of the rights of and concerns for future generations: man-made climate change is not only global, but it's also intergenerational. And if earlier generations exploit the future by taking modest benefits for themselves now, they're likely to pass on potentially catastrophic costs for future generations. Take, for example, greenhouse gas, carbon dioxide. It is difficult to extract carbon dioxide from the atmosphere once it's deposited there, and current CO emissions will have effect at some future time. So, in other words, their effects are time delayed. So, the ethical principle of the rights of and concerns for future generations needs to look at two particular aspects: that of reciprocity and discounting, and I'll refer to both of those. In the case of reciprocity, different generations do not share the same time horizon and cannot influence one another reciprocally. So where in utilitarian thinking and contract theory, if damage is done by a party, the reciprocal right is for the person damaged to be able to claim some sort of compensation. That doesn't apply with future generations, because by the time they want their compensation, we are no longer here. So it's a problem that we need to look at as to how far ahead we consider future generations. And the Comest report said it's no good looking at, far ahead in terms of future generations. It's better to think perhaps 100 years ahead, where you can identify more carefully who the future generation is going to be, and even begin to plan what reciprocal rights there could be in terms of the damage that we may do at the current time. And they go on to say that it puts us in a position of reciprocating in advance. Concerning discounting, another aspect of future generations debate is that Tony Blair, when Prime Minister, asked Lord Stern, who is an economist, if he would look at climate change from an economic perspective. And Lord Stern's review was published in 2006. Stern used cost-benefit analysis based on overwhelming case for urgent, immediate and rapid reductions in greenhouse gas emissions on the grounds that Brexit, so unfortunately it's a while back. Stern adopted the annual discount rate at which future costs and benefits are discounted, known as the social discount rate, of close to zero. However, some economists argued that the welfare of people living in the future should be discounted at a higher rate than Stern's closer to zero, and they suggested more of a market rate of 3%. In other words, the welfare of those residing in the future should receive less weight than allowed for in Stern's review, because the higher the rate, the lower the value for those in the future. So Stern's critics advocated only a modest rate of emission reductions in the near future, followed by greater reductions in the longer term, in the belief that the world economy would probably grow richer and technological capacities would develop over time, which is questionable, of course. So today's businesses need to reflect on how much attention and perhaps how much investment they're going to make to help future generations or to cut back on their emissions, etc. at the present time. I have also identified what I would call several ethical values, but I'm only going to refer to two. Ethical values are somewhat different from ethical principles. Principles are really founding guidelines in institutions, whereas values are more akin to character traits, whether for businesses or individuals. They're like honesty, integrity, and the two I'm going to refer to are openness and trust. Openness in respect of climate change means transparency and disclosure by companies of their climate-related financial risks. So whatever companies are doing, nevertheless, they probably face some risks, particularly those in the oil, gas and coal industries. And investors are concerned that unless those risks are made clear, the investments could lose out in the future by perhaps loss of public trust and in the companies if they're generating too many fossil fuels. So an industry-led task force was created on climate-related financial disclosure, which came under the Financial Stability Board, and it published its recommendations to companies about how it should reveal these financial climate risks. More than 100 companies, their voluntary principle or voluntary recommendations by the task force, and more than 100 companies globally signed a statement affirming their support for these recommendations. And some of the investors, particularly Aviva investors looking on, said unless companies were clearly stating what their financial risks due to climate change are, they may not invest in them and they may not vote for them at their annual general meetings. So obviously, that's important for companies to reveal the risks, but on the other hand, in so doing, they could put themselves in a somewhat vulnerable position. Trust as the other ethical value. Trust is important to businesses as an ethical value to incorporate in their code of conduct, code of ethics. Trust in practice is a relationship between parties, the one who places his or her trust in another who holds it. And a betrayal of trust damages the relationship, which cannot always be restored. And with regret, we have seen breaches of trust. So this is, if you like, the unethical side of trust. And in particular, Volkswagen, the German car manufacturer, has, admittedly by its former chief executive, lost the trust, not only of governments, but also of consumers. And this came about as early as 2006, while Volkswagen engineers were helping to develop a new diesel engine for the US market. And their engineers realised that customers would want good performance, but if they got good performance through the release of nitrogen oxides from the engines, then they would be in breach of the new US law, environmental laws. So the engineers brought out a computer device, which meant that when their new diesel cars were in the laboratory, the device worked and met the pollution requirements for the US. But as soon as they were out on the road, the device was inactivated and the nitrogen oxide fumes and contamination was in breach of the law, but at this stage the US hadn't realised. Worse still, Volkswagen actually gave a publicity campaign to say how good its new cars are. But shortly afterwards, well, sometime afterwards, in 2015, the US Environmental Protection Agency discovered that many Volkswagen cars sold in America were fitted with this so-called defeat device, and the US government demanded Volkswagen to recall thousands of their cars and all the cars produced since 2009. And it was found also that certain other car manufacturers were also polluting more than they should have been, but they weren't necessarily using this computer device that Volkswagen was. So their then CEO, Martin Winterkorn, who's since resigned, said, "We've broken the trust of our customers and the public." And he is now this year just been said to be prosecuted in Germany by prosecutors, but also in the US, although it's not known whether it will go ahead definitely in the US. So the unethical behaviour of some automobile companies, including breaches of trust, have added to the environmental pollution. So to conclude, Lord Stern developed another lecture, or he delivered another lecture 10 years after his report, his review of 2006, at the London School of Economics in October 2016. And he said that the science of climate change is robust, but everything is worse than he had anticipated back in 2006. And he pointed out that he did not agree with increasing this percentage of the social discount rate to 3% to market level, because he said markets do not have ethical dimensions. But he did nevertheless say how good one or two companies have been and other bodies in investing in the UN Climate Fund and other investments. And he pointed to the Swedish National Pension Fund, which up until 2016 had made the biggest low-carbon commitment of an institutional investor, which is $3.2 billion in investment funds. And IKEA has also pledged €1 billion on renewable energy and climate change efforts. Certain organisations or certain investors have withdrawn now from fossil fuel investments, and some of the Catholic institutions, perhaps spurred on by the Pope, who spoke out on this matter in 2016, have actually withdrawn their investments in fossil fuels and coal, tar and sands, and petroleum in particular. Migration patterns are affected by climate change because when there is this disturbance by floods and storms, of displacing people in countries, then they're either moving to another part within their country or over borders to another country. And it has been estimated that in 2015, 14.7 million people were displaced due to disasters triggered by weather-related hazards, primarily flooding and storms. And then, perhaps to remedy a little the damage caused by the car manufacturers, the move towards electric cars is helping, to overcome the pollution that that has in the past existed and to a certain extent does exist at the moment. But the UK government has vowed that from year 2040, as part of its air quality plan, it's going to scrap diesel and petrol cars, with drivers being allowed to buy only electrically powered cars. So that really concludes my talk, and if you have any questions, please do ask.
any questions that people would like to propose?
Yes. Why is the target for shutting down the purchase of new petrol and diesel vehicles 21 years ahead?
Yeah.
Isn't that a really feeble target?
Well, that's right. Some of the campaigners, Extinction Rebellion, for example, they are calling for government action right across the field of climate change damage, if you like. Policies to be brought forward. Yes, it is a long time ahead.
I mean, as I understand it, correct me if I've got this wrong, but that is for preventing by changing the law purchase of new ones at
yes,
that time.
that's
It's
right.
not phasing them all out.
Well, I think
really we've got electric vehicles in production now.
Yeah.
All the major manufacturers are working fiendishly, they'd have us believe, on this. So really 21 years, it's absurd. You know, we're not trying.
that could change, I think, you know, with pressure groups, but also, as you say, with the fact that the manufacturers are bringing them forward. We've got the hybrid ones, you know, where you can move from electric to petrol. But I think it's also, we've got to have these places where you can plug in and get the electricity. And I mean, in rural places, it's going to,
it's surely doable in 10 years.
Yes, so that brings us to 2030, which is the date really for the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals to be reached by, which include climate change. Yes, that it needs campaigners to take that up with the government, doesn't it? Whichever government there is at the moment. Sorry, sorry.
The whole concept of business and ethics is debatable to start with, but if you've got the corporate business model, it depends on growth, constant growth, and is that being addressed? Because as we've seen, that the levels of carbon emissions have increased hugely in the last 30 years.
Yes, that's right.
And it's all based on growth. And is the business sector prepared, or even to consider that growth may not be an option? Because as we stand now, as soon as businesses or the financial sector talk about anything opposite to growth, you never have a level of sustainability. You have this panic button of stagnation, and they've got to get away from that concept that it's got something to be frightened of, because we cannot keep producing and using the resources we have now at the level, and therefore there's got to be a levelling off so that we're sustainable rather than this increased growth. Even with cars, we're still talking about producing more cars, whether they're electric or diesel or petrol. The actual process of production is hugely consumptive of natural resources. I mean, we can't keep going at this level, but the business sector, I don't think has even got that concept. They can't grab that concept.
Well, you are right that the levels of CO2 emission, in the atmosphere, the emissions at the moment is the highest level that there ever has been in history. I think that with the growth of companies, if they are working towards reducing their carbon footprint, etc., that sort of growth is not as bad as if they're ignoring that. But your point about cars being produced, I was in China in the year 2002 for our centre, being shown around by senior government officials of China in Beijing. And I said to them, because cars, it wasn't too bad, I mean there weren't as many cars in Beijing then as there are now, and I said to them, are you going to limit the number of cars a family can have in the same way that the number of children has been. And I thought they might have seriously considered that, since, you know, they have the power, if you like, to do that. And they said no. So 2002, we're now 2019, and of course air pollution in Beijing and Shanghai and India, in Delhi, it's very, very bad. So, and cars are being manufactured all the time, but I suppose the electric ones, once we move over, or once nations move over to electric only, that won't be polluting so much. With other things, in terms of growth, I suppose we may have a more varied type of corporate entities. You know, we've got a lot of small companies now developing, people working at home and running their own companies. And some of the products we need, as we've seen with health, and some of the demands for some of the drugs which aren't available. It's a good point you've raised, but you can't rule out growth altogether, I suppose. It's just how the growth is made and in what fields it's made.
Well, and consumption.
Yeah,
Consumer
well, that's
society.
right. No, we are a society that does consume all the time, aren't we? You only have to go into a supermarket to see all these things placed near the checkout, you know, encouraging consumption. Should I first take that?
Yes, throughout my career in private manufacturing, it was always drummed into me that the responsibility of directors was entirely to the well-being of their shareholders, the interest. It had to serve the interest of the shareholders. It by and large meant positive cash flow maximised over time. Public trust, you mentioned, certainly was an important issue, but it doesn't seem to me likely that companies will spontaneously act in the common good unless there is legislation. It was legislation that changed our behaviour, by and large. The Volkswagen case only arose because of legislation.
Well, that has changed now that we've got more attention to corporate social responsibility, where, you know, shareholders are one of a number of stakeholders, as the term now has moved really from sole shareholders to stakeholders, which includes the staff in the company, members of the public or customers and so on. And there is some legislation in the Companies Act of the UK where directors have to show what they're doing in a number of areas that we might call ethical, really. For example, how many women they're employing, the different price, what they're paying men and women as staff, how many women they've got on the board, but also what they are doing on the environmental side. So they have to disclose in the UK Companies Act, in the Directors' Report, what they are doing for environmental and social issues. So we have moved a little. Whether we've moved enough, and whether you can actually understand that part of the Directors' Report with all the other material that goes in the Directors' Report. You know, but there has been a certain move. Yes. Did you do another word?
I'm just going to chip in again that we can talk about growth in economic terms, and the business will think of growth in those terms: more revenue, more profitability, better return, and so on. But as a society, we can grow sort of collectively in other ways. If air pollution is reduced, and because of that we're all a bit healthier, that's a growth in quality of life, growth in our environment. If we can have enough material goods by working fewer hours, because automation has given us some overall productivity benefits, and that's enabled that, then that's a kind of growth. And somehow, as a society, I think we've got to move towards that be satisfied with more leisure, more music in our lives, and cut down from a 5-litre car to a bicycle.
Well, I think very recently, probably only this year, there have been recommendations put forward, not the same as you're saying, but for eating less meat, for example,
Yes.
hasn't there, and having the temperature of heating our homes down to a much lower degree than 22 degrees Celsius, and it's everybody, isn't it? It's not just business companies or governments, it's the general population as well that have to make a sacrifice if we are going to...
But to push them along, several people have said the same thing, that numerous institutions, their whole structure is geared towards economic profit and gain and growth.
And consumerism,
somehow to come away from that, and that would take not just a good feeling, a willingness by every Joe Soap in town. It's going to have to be that, certainly, but through law. And you've got the lead and the targets at the UN level.
Yeah.
And perhaps in countries like the UK and much of Europe, there's a high degree of support and efforts at conformance with that. Perhaps not big enough efforts, but at least there's something. Now, how are you going to turn around the US, which is certainly, I know what you're saying about individual companies who are advertising what they're doing because they're talking to their customers at the end of the day, their customers and their investors, and saying, we're standing back from Trump's view of the world a bit, this is what we're doing. And that's all great. But what about China, India, the third world in general, who are, have got so far to go to catch up with the perceived wealth and lifestyle that's common in the West, and say, it's not fair you're telling us to cut back at this stage, you've messed up the world, then pile the pressure on us to put it right for you.
Well, I think that's where we do need to look at the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement, because...
Does China really listen to the United Nations?
Well, I think it listens more than it used to, because its market has become more global. I mean, for a long time China's market was very much its own market. It wasn't exporting a lot. They didn't know much about branding. Now they have moved to wanting to sell more goods abroad. So I think they're listening more than they did. But it is true that the developing countries like China, India, and others are polluting, to a greater extent than at the moment than, say, developed countries. But that is why the UN wanted to have this international cooperation and the money through the UN Green Fund, Climate Fund, to help developing countries to reduce their or to lower their emissions.
Could I just ask you to clarify this fund? Is this a fund that institutions and companies and governments are paying into that the UN then spends, or are people claiming that they're doing this, this and this already, therefore that's 98% of our necessary contribution to the fund taken care of, and all the usual bullshit?
It's certainly one that governments and businesses need to contribute to and are encouraged to contribute to. It's coming under that part of the UN that is the UN climate framework for UN Convention framework.
How this real money is spent.
Well, it would be the Convention framework on climate change, which is a UN body, but it's that body that is particularly in charge of the fund. Whether how it's spent needs further research, really. I'm not quite sure. They want this amount of $100 billion annually by 2020 to be in the fund. I would have thought it was under the auspices of the convention framework for climate change
They'll
that
probably
it is.
sort of delegate things back to
Yeah.
governments to actually operate.
Or back to some of the development banks, I would think, to spend it. Yeah, it has to obviously be spent carefully because there's quite a lot of corruption in some of those countries as well. So, yeah.
Could I have a question at the back?
Yeah, if there's nobody else. As far as I understand it, China per capita doesn't produce the same pollution as the European countries. That's a statistic. The UN statements and reviews, etc., are really the idea of the world. But I'd ask you, are the IMF and the World Bank going along with it? Because if they don't, they are the driving force of the whole global financial system. And if they don't change, which they don't appear to be, there's very little hope, because they are setting the pattern for ethics, if you like, business plans. And if they don't change, then all the companies, especially the global companies, won't change very much.
Well, the World Bank does have its own initiatives for financial contributions to climate change. It's got several sorts which can be accessed on Google. You can see what they're doing. So while whether it's contributing to the $100 billion annually, I think it's more likely that it's got its own fund and it's doing its own thing, but it is nevertheless making a contribution, as you say, economically, to have the money for developing countries and the West to improve their climate change situation.
But if they're still their business model for lending money to countries, if that doesn't change, then the actual superficiality of having a fund to offset some of the things they're actually doing with one hand is playing against the other.
Yes, you're quite right.
They don't appear to be changing their attitude.
No, you're quite right. It does need to be tied up with development money and lending and so on. I mean, the Chinese have in fact gone into countries and lent a lot of money in Africa and so on, but I don't think they've tied it in either to climate change, but more to perhaps what they're going to get out of it in terms of power and association with the country. No, it's a very good point you said, yes. It needs more pressure there again too, doesn't it?
Where's the urgency?
Yeah, that's right, yes.
We've got time for one more question.
What would you say is the single most impactful thing that a company can do to address the urgency of the climate issues that we're facing at the minute? If there's one single recommendation you'd give, what do all companies need to be doing?
Well, I think they're linked really. There's one thing is a linked number of things, like for example reducing their carbon footprint of their transport or the way their goods are made, as well as reducing their emissions where they can themselves, and linked to that, making sure that when they build or have their premises, that they don't overuse the electricity or heating and so on. I can give one example of a company that I have not been associated with. I've been an independent person commenting on the annual report of a Spanish company called Inditex, which has as one of its brands the Zara chain, which particularly women know. Now, they are really top of the Spanish lists of ethical companies. And when I read their annual report, because I have to read the English version before it, because they produce one in English and Spanish, but any corrections to the English one are sometimes picked up in the Spanish one as well. But I'm amazed at the contributions they make in all these areas. You know, the attention if they're creating a new shop in a different country or a different town, the great attention they pay to the lighting, the heating and everything, and it's well worth, if anybody wants to look at their annual report for last year. It hasn't come out yet. Well, it would be the 2017 and 18 ones.
I think the media actually have a responsibility to share success stories like
Yes,
that,
I
and
think
see what good looks like. Because it's
Yes.
easy to talk
Yes.
about what we're doing wrong. People should be talking about what we're doing right,
Yes.
and holding us all to account to act in similar ways. And that's an interesting one, because I'm aware of how Zara is changing the way that it's manufacturing its clothing.
Yes.
It's even investing in new types of materials like leather made out of
Yes,
pineapple,
that's
for
right.
example. And unless you start to look for this information, you don't know it. So it's back to, I guess, extinction of values. Yes, the media have got to tell the truth, but they've got to tell the truth. We've all got to share success stories where people are doing things well as well, I think.
Yeah, that's quite right.
Yeah.
The other
encouragement rather than just saying just do them.
The other slight difficulty, in a sense, with Inditex is, being a Spanish company, it's well known by its group name, Inditex, in
Yes.
Spain. It's not really known
No,
so well by
I
that
didn't know that brand name.
in the UK. You know, it's known by the individual brands, particularly the Zara brand. And maybe when I have to submit my comments on their report later in June, it'd be worth making that point. But certainly I'm really astounded by the effort they put in, and I think their chairman was given a Harvard University award last year for the efforts, but as you say, there wasn't a great deal of publicity, not in this country anyway, either to that award as a leading businessman.
I think you could argue that we shouldn't be encouraging people to buy more and more clothes anyway, and the fashion, the whole thing of it, the whole production, the whole growth and changing clothes.
But it isn't Primark. I mean, I think what you're saying can apply to Primark. It's a throwaway one, isn't it? I think Inditex, does think through these things, and it's certainly not clothes that you throw away. They are more expensive, and they do a great deal in also in looking at the conditions of factories overseas and sending social auditors out to make sure that child labour is not used. And they also do spend a lot of money whenever there is a crisis, whether it's a burning of a clothes factory in Bangladesh, to which they sent a huge amount of money, or whether it's simply relief where there's been a bad storm and so on. They do put a great deal of money in it. But that's why I think they're number one on the ethical front in Spain. But there's not enough companies that really give that attention and investment to these improvements.
Good. On that note of more publicity for the ones that are doing it well. Thank you.